Good afternoon. Thank you for joining here in the room and thank you for joining online. This afternoon, I'm very, very pleased to introduce Robbe Saesen. Robbe conducted his joint PhD at EORTC under the supervision of Dr. Denis Lacombe and KU Leuven in the pharmaceutical sciences at the Clinical Pharmacology and Pharmacotherapy Research Unit under the supervision of Professor Isabelle Heus. He defended last year, happy to join your online, well, I joined online your defense. Robbe has a master's degree in drug development of the KU Leuven, and during his studies he became fascinated by clinical research, which is why he decided to pursue a PhD on the re-engineering of the process of clinical cancer research in today's data-driven healthcare system. He recently joined Cienzano to work at the Belgian Cancer Center, more particularly in the policy implementation, monitoring and evaluation team under the leadership of Mark van den Bulke. He will today elaborate on his PhD work and tell us more about why we need to be more idealistic about pragmatic trials to bridge the evidence gap in oncology. Robbe, the floor is yours. Maybe for those who join online, don't hesitate to raise your hands or ask your question to Robbe if you feel you want to discuss with him. Thank you, Robbe.
Thank you very much for this great introduction, Professor Stevens, and also, of course, for the invitation to be here today, also Professor Goldman. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about a topic which is kind of very dear to my heart, pragmatic trials. Before I start, I wanted to introduce myself shortly, but I think Professor Stevens has already covered most of this. So as I said, of course, I'm Belgian with a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from the University of Leuven, where I worked with Professor Isabelle Heus. I was also a research fellow at the EORTC, the European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer, which is an independent, not-for-profit organization conducting clinical research, specifically non-commercial clinical research in oncology. Where I worked with Dr. Denis Lacombe, the Chief Executive Officer of the EORTC. I was also, for a short period of time, a collaborating expert at the European Medicines Agency, so I also have some background, let's say, in regulatory science. I worked in the task force Regulatory Science and Innovation. And I'm currently working at the Belgian Cancer Center, which is part of Cienzano, within the Policy Implementation Monitoring and Evaluation team, where we, well, the name says itself, you know. It's we monitor and evaluate policy relating to cancer in Belgium, and specifically also the implementation of Europe's Beating Cancer Plan and the Cancer Mission in Belgium. So before I start my presentation, I want to give a short overview of what cancer is, because of course that will be the main topic of my presentation. So what is cancer? Cancer in a nutshell. So cancer is not one singular disease. It's really an umbrella term that is used to refer to a group of diseases, which can be quite heterogeneous in nature, but they are all characterized by the uncontrolled growth and spread of cells. This uncontrolled growth is caused by genetic mutations, so mutations in our genes. And these mutations, they can be occurring spontaneously. They can also be inherited. They can be passed on from parent to child, or they can also be induced by environmental factors, including chemical carcinogens like cigarette smoke, physical carcinogens like UV radiation from the sun, and even biological carcinogens like, for example, viruses, HPV, for example. Now, cancer poses an enormous burden in the European Union, but also worldwide, of course. So in the year 2020, there were 2.7 million new cases of cancer registered in the EU, and 1.3 million deaths attributable to the disease. So it represents basically the second leading cause of death in the EU after cardiovascular diseases. Also economically, cancer poses an enormous burden. So in 2018, it was estimated that the disease cost European healthcare systems about 199 billion euros, which amounts to about 378 euros per capita. So it's quite a large number. Now, luckily, there are a number of options available to treat cancer. For example, there's surgery, so we can cut the cancerous tissue from the body. We can also irradiate the cancerous tissue with ionizing radiation, which is radiotherapy, of course. We can also give certain drugs to people that kill cancer cells or stop cancer cells from growing. We have different types of drugs available, like chemotherapy, which is, let's say, more aspecific. But we also have immunotherapy, which leverages the immune system's ability to identify and destroy cancer cells. We have targeted therapy, which specifically targets certain cancer cells that express certain regulatory proteins. And we also have hormonal therapy, which is relevant for some cancers that are sensitive to endocrine signals. And then, of course, we also have cell and gene therapy, which is, I guess, the most modern version of cancer treatment, where this kind of treatment even holds the promise of completely curing the disease and even addressing the mutation at its core. But that is, of course, still under development for the most part. Now, how do we get new cancer treatments? I think that's a relevant question to ask. Basically, let's look at specifically the pathway for drugs, because they follow the most complicated path to the clinic. And as you can see here, this is a sort of simplification of the process. This path consists of several distinct steps, which are interconnected and which are, let's say, generally sequential. So they follow each other up. And during each of these steps, specific studies are conducted and specific data are collected. Some of these studies are performed in a lab, in a Petri dish. Others are performed in animals, in laboratory animals. And of course, others are also performed in human volunteers, clinical trial participants. Now, there's an important milestone in this process, which is the regulatory approval milestone. Because at this point, what that milestone signifies is essentially that the developer of the drug can enter their product onto the market. So it's a very important step in the process. It also divides the process into two parts, the pre-approval part and the post-approval part. And the regulatory approval is heavily based on the data that are produced during phase 3 clinical research, during the step that immediately precedes the regulatory review step. So let's take a closer look at that step, because as I said, the data that are generated during that step will heavily influence the decision to approve the drug. So the studies that are performed during phase 3 clinical research are typically randomized controlled trials, or RCTs for short. So what are randomized controlled trials? Well, in a randomized controlled trial, you take a group of patients that are eligible to join your trial, that satisfy a number of specific selection criteria, and that are, of course, also willing to join the trial. And you randomize these patients to one of two groups. So you randomly assign them to one of two or multiple groups, let's say two in this case, to make it simple. So on the one hand, you have the comparator group. This group typically receives some kind of standard therapy that is already available to patients in the clinic. And then you also have the treatment group, which receives an experimental treatment. And then what you do eventually is to compare these two groups in terms of what we call the primary endpoint of the trial, which is basically just a metric that measures some kind of biological improvement, for example, a shrinking of the tumor or the duration of survival of patients in both groups. And what is essential here is this randomization step. That is really the step that provides randomized controlled trials with their methodological rigor, because that ensures that the two groups differ only from each other in terms of the treatment they received and not in terms of any other factor that could have an influence on the outcome of the trial. So if we look at the pyramid of evidence-based medicine, we see that randomized controlled trials are really high up in the pyramid, which means that they produce evidence of high quality. They really have an important role in medicine, individually, but also collectively in the form of meta-analyses, for example. So really, these kinds of studies influence to a large extent how we treat patients and how medical guidelines, for example, are composed. So they are very important studies. However, if we look at RCTs in oncology, they have some important limitations, I would say. First of all, the patients that participate in these studies, the patient samples that you get in these studies, are often not representative of the real world patients, the real world patient population. What research has consistently shown, for example, is that participants in RCTs, in oncology, but also beyond, are younger, more able-bodied, have a better prognosis, and are disproportionately white and male compared to their off-trial peers, let's say. That's already an important observation. Moreover, as I said, the participants need to satisfy, let's say, a long list of specific selection criteria. And if we apply those criteria, it's also been shown that up to 90% of patients in the real world, let's say, would be ineligible for participation in clinical trials. So that's a large number. You're already excluding up to 90% of all patients to even join the trial. So those are two important observations, I think, and that combines into one important limitation. A second limitation is that the comparator treatments that are used in RCTs, in oncology, are often substandard. And what I mean by substandard is that they are not reflective of the standard of care. So the patients in the comparator group often do not receive the best available treatment that is available in the clinic. This has been also quantified, and it's been shown that about 25% of pivotal trials, so trials that are directly leading to marketing authorization of cancer drugs, have such a substandard comparator arm, so quite a large proportion. Then a third important limitation is that many of these trials rely on endpoints that are called surrogate endpoints and that are not validated. What do I mean by a surrogate endpoint? A surrogate endpoint is an endpoint that sort of acts as a substitute for a more relevant endpoint. So if you look at what should a cancer drug ideally do, it should ideally extend patients' lives, and preferably even, and it should improve the quality of the patient's life. Those are, I think, the two most essential or most fundamental effects that a cancer drug should have. But in reality, both of those things are difficult to measure in practice. And so what is often done is that basically a surrogate is used, so a substitute for those two endpoints, basically endpoints that are thought to correlate with survival, with quality of life. But in what we see in practice is that they are often not validated, that this correlation has often not been shown in practice. So as I've said, these surrogate endpoints are often not predictive of overall survival or quality of life. And on top of that, we see that now around 61% of drug RCTs in oncology use such surrogate endpoints instead of overall survival or quality of life. Just to give you an example of one of these surrogate endpoints that is often used, for example, the response rate, which measures essentially the percentage of patients that have a shrinkage of the tumor beyond a certain threshold. That alone is not necessarily reflective of survival. It's not necessarily a metric that will also predict whether patients will live longer in the end. That's an important remark here. There are other surrogate endpoints as well, but usually what they have in common is that they are based on arbitrary thresholds, and those are not necessarily linked to any clinical relevance. And the last important limitation is that these trials often have an overly commercial focus. This is because, of course, conducting clinical trials is expensive. It takes a lot of time, a lot of money. And often the only, let's say, stakeholders that are capable of investing that amount of time and money is the industry, because in the end, they will get some kind of return, some kind of return on investment from their initial investment. So that's an important observation as well. Of course, we cannot really blame the industry for that. It's not their fault that they do things that eventually will make them money. That's kind of their entire raison d'être, let's say. But it's an important fact because right now, for example, we see that about 90% of drug RCTs in oncology are funded by industry. So yeah, that's of course a very significant amount of drug RCTs that are actually set up for a commercial reason. What that often means is that there can be a lack of certain topics that are addressed in these kind of RCTs. For example, de-escalation, head-to-head comparison, combination, and therapeutic sequencing. Those are kind of topics that are not necessarily commercially interesting, but are nevertheless, of course, important to investigate because they can lead to very effective treatment strategies. Other topics which are not listed here is, of course, repurposing, for example, is one of these elements that is important here, or also trials in rare diseases where there's also not a lot of, let's say, commercial incentive to invest.
So the previous slide was very, very interesting. I was starting to think indeed, why is it that, for example, you have substandard comparator treatment? I mean, why couldn't the EMA or FDA say, look, we will only look at serious RCTs? Now, what you're saying at the end suggests we are giving a lot of control to industry about how they conduct RCTs. And the question is, of course, why do we allow this?
Yeah.
I guess, will that be the focus of your talk or what?
Well, it will. I wouldn't say it's the focus of my talk, but it's an important question. Why do we allow that? I think right now our regulatory system is very much focused on finding new things, new drugs, new therapies, new treatments, because we kind of all hold, let's say, the belief that, let's say innovation will lead to improvements in survival and quality of life, and it has, which is of course important. So I think the regulatory system is very much geared towards that. It's also geared towards, let's say, just benefit risk balance. That's basically what EMA, for example, evaluates. It's the only thing really that EMA looks at, whether or not the benefits outweigh the risk. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your drug needs to perform better than what is available on the market. It just means that your drug needs to have, the benefit that your drug brings should be higher than the let's say, the side effects that it causes. That's really the only metric that EMA looks at. So EMA doesn't look at what is available on the market. That's more a question of economics, let's say, and which is more something that is addressed on a national level by, for example, HTA bodies. But of course, at that point, it's often too late because something that has been approved by EMA has to be processed on a national level. And then you get sort of, let's say, conflicting priorities between HTA bodies and EMA, where then often, of course, industry prioritizes the requirements that are set by EMA because those are the ones that are, coming first on the way to the market. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. There's, I think, in recent years, some more approach like HTA and EMA are kind of like approaching each other more and trying to come to an agreement on, for example, these comparator arms, but it's a very difficult process because they just have a very different, very different legal framework behind them, but also a very different mindset in terms of this kind of thing.
It seems obvious that the EMA should do its job better, and we should only accept drugs that are better than existing drugs. I mean, somehow. I mean, that's what, by the way, that's how patent law works. Huh? Is it new and not obvious? Huh? So it's so is it? By the way, in the US, it's not better. There is a paper, a very nice paper by Andrew Lowe, professor of finance at MIT, and works a lot on health economics. And the FDA, they have this fast track system whereby if what you're trying to do is ambitious and promising, it can go faster. And they show that fast track is much less profitable than slow track. So, the money is in the meters, which again is the same problem as here. I mean, why do we allow the system to be, maybe
I propose that we move forward because, it's, I mean, we could spend a full seminar on this because, in cancer, standard of care is very often a matter of debate. Why? Most cancer are not curable. So obviously you have drugs which are approved, you have drugs in development, you have possible combination of drugs for which there is no definitive proof, but so the standard of care is what your physician proposed to you when you consult him with a cancer. And different physicians will certainly propose different treatments. So I would be, I mean, these are two strong sentences. I think that in real life, things are more subtle. And I think that those comparisons are still valid. There is also this question of non-inferiority and all, but this is another debate. So, but I would not like that, those around the table or online
Yeah.
So people would say, well, look, industry is financing EMA, and that's the reason why EMA is probably not using the best comparator. I mean, this type of arguments I often hear. I think things are much more complicated.
Of course, yeah.
But we will not enter into that.
No, indeed.
Unless you discuss further.
No. I will not try to speculate on the motivations behind it, but I think these figures are kind of important to show because, it's important, I think, to let's say look a bit at the landscape from that perspective as well, from a high level perspective. Okay, so let me go on to the next slide. So what these limitations result in is really kind of a gap between clinical development on the one hand and clinical practice on the other. And this gap it represents sort of a no man's land at the interface between different priorities and often competing priorities. For example, a lot of the things that are done in the clinical development phase are regulated on a supranational level, whereas in clinical practice, the national level comes into play, like I've also discussed before. Here are also some other competing interests, let's say, at the interface between these two different aspects. And what does this gap lead to? Of course, it leads to uncertainty. And this uncertainty in turn can lead to, of course, this is broadly speaking again, it could lead to the coverage and adoption of costly, but at the same time ineffective, or let's say not so effective as originally foreseen, and potentially even harmful therapy. So it's quite an important observation, I think. So then, of course, the obvious question is, how do we bridge that gap? And that's exactly the question that I investigated during my PhD research. And during my PhD research, I focused on two potential approaches to bridge this gap. On the one hand, the observational approaches, so where you just observe what happens when the drug enters the market and is administered in the general patient population, and you can derive some insights from the data that are collected at that stage. And the other is more focusing on interventional approaches, where we actually expose a specific select group of patients to the drug, for example. And this happens then under, of course, the supervision of an experienced investigator and also in accordance with a detailed trial protocol. So these are two different approaches that could potentially help bridge the gap, and I've investigated both approaches. So let me first discuss the observational approaches. So with respect to the observational approaches, I should mention here the topic of real-world data, because it's really a hot topic in oncology, but also beyond. What exactly are real-world data? Well, there are different definitions for this concept. I think the most, let's say, relevant definition here today, it's a simple definition as well, is that real-world data are health data collected outside of traditional clinical trials and typically routinely. So within our healthcare systems, there's a lot of data being collected simply to support the provision of care to patients. And real-world data kind of tries to use that data that is already being collected typically to generate new insights. So it's kind of a secondary use of existing data. Now, a related concept to real-world data is real-world evidence. It's not the same concept. They're often kind of confused, but they have a different meaning. So real-world evidence is kind of the evidence derived from the analysis of real-world data. So I always compare this to these typical connect the dots type puzzles. So the real world data are the individual dots, and the real world evidence is the evidence you get when you connect the dots in the right way and you get the picture, let's say. And this, I think, is also an apt comparison because it kind of also shows that depending on how you connect the dots, you can get different insights, right? So it's very important to know how to analyze these data, because otherwise you might risk getting completely different outcomes. Now, real data can be taken from, derived from a number of different sources. For example, electronic health records, which are, of course, records of patients' interactions with their healthcare providers. We also have patient registries, which are collecting data longitudinally on a group of specific patients that are characterized by, for example, their receipt of a specific treatment. And then we have treatment registries, or by their specific disease, and then we have disease registries. We also have administrative claims, which are claims submitted by healthcare providers to payers in order to get reimbursed for the services they provide to their patients. And then, let's say, more adventurous sources of real-world data also include wearable devices, smartphones. Of course, these collect interesting information like sleeping patterns or movement or heart rhythm. And also social media is even considered a source of real-world data nowadays. What we see really in oncology, but also beyond, is increasing stakeholder interest in real-world data and real-world evidence, and it makes sense. These data are often available. It makes sense to use what we have at our disposal. So really, real-world data and real-world evidence are very much hot topics. We see that, of course, now with the proposal to establish a European health data space, which will allow patients to access their data in a cross-border fashion, but will also allow researchers to analyze these data for research purposes. We also have the Darwin EU initiative, which is the Data Analytics and Real-World Interrogation Network, which is actually a distributed network of real-world data sources that is maintained by the EMA and is used by EMA to answer regulatory questions. So that's also an important source or an important development within real-world data and real-world evidence. We have other things like the Get Real Institute, which offers specific training on real-world data and tries to establish best practices for analyzing such data. Within the IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, we had the Big Data for Better Outcomes program, where there were a number of important projects launched, including the Eden project, which tries to kind of map existing real-world data sources to a common data model. What we often see is that these sources are formatted differently, and it is more difficult to connect them, let's say, if they are in different formats. So the Eden project tries to map all of these data sources to a common data model, the OMOP, common data model more specifically. And then, of course, during COVID-19, I think it was a real boost also to real-world data, real-world evidence, because we really had to get answers to research questions very fast, very quickly. We couldn't really wait in many occasions for a clinical trial to be set up, conducted, and generate results, because that often takes a longer period of time. So real-world data was also very important during the COVID pandemic. So what are the strengths of real-world data and real-world evidence?
May I interrupt you?
Yeah, of course.
Just for 1 second? Those real-world data, could you specify when they are precisely collected? Is it after regulatory agency approval, or is it after introduction on the market, dissemination? Because, sometimes, as you know very well, there is a significant gap there. My understanding is real-world data start to be collected once the drug is really disseminated at a large scale, which means, well, COVID vaccine might be an exception, but meaning when they reach the market. Is it correct or not?
Yes, of course, indeed. Yeah. So the treatment in question needs to be available for use to patients. So that means that it needs to be in many occasions.
So we will further discuss this later, because we have a concern about this gap I just mentioned, but we will come back to this later.
Yeah, happy to discuss. So let's look at the strengths of real-world data and real-world evidence. Why are real-world evidence and real-world data so popular nowadays, let's say? Well, on the first, let's say primarily there's 3 types of benefits, I would say, 3 categories of benefits that can be attributed to real-world data and real-world evidence. A first type of benefit, it benefits in terms of speed. So basically analyzing real-world data doesn't take as much time as conducting a randomized controlled trial. So that's, of course, an important factor. It allows you to generate results faster. Secondly, which is related also to the first benefit, is benefits in terms of cost. These kinds of studies, you can expect if they are faster to conduct, that they also will cost less money to conduct. So the studies that analyze these type of real-world data are often less expensive, not always, but often. And then a third category of benefits is benefits in terms of scale and scope. So if you look at the samples that are being analyzed within these real-world data studies, you often see that these samples are much larger than what you get in a randomized controlled trial. Often also more representative, because there is less, let's say, selection criteria applied to the samples. Again, not always, but this is kind of, I'm painting it with a broad brush here. So these are 3 important benefits of real-world data and real-world evidence, and I think have explained for a large part why these kind of data are being used more and more nowadays. Of course, there's also barriers and challenges associated with the generation of reliable real-world evidence. There's, for example, operational hurdles relating to accessing the data. Right now, these data are often within hospitals in silos, difficult to access. Protecting the data, there's the GDPR, you need to comply, of course, with legal standards in that sense. There's also the challenges relating to sharing data. So those are kind of the operational hurdles. Then you have the technical hurdles, which relate more to the formatting of the data, which I've already touched upon, validating the data, linking the data from different sources together. Those are important technical challenges associated with that. And then thirdly, and I think most importantly, there's also a lot of methodological hurdles. Because real data, it's important to understand that these data have not been collected for the purpose of supporting research. They've been collected for a different objective. So often they are not fit for purpose, let's say. And that leads to some methodological hurdles. For example, confounding factors. The data are not derived from a randomized experiment. So you have confounding factors that come into play. There's all kinds of biases that can occur, like misclassification bias, selection bias, and these kind of things, really pose an important barrier to the quality of real-world evidence and to the generation of reliable real-world evidence. Of course, the question is, how do we overcome these hurdles? I don't think I will touch too much upon this right now, but yeah, let's say there's a lot of research going on around all of these, and some of the hurdles are less difficult to overcome than others, of course. If we look at oncology,
maybe ask a question.
Yeah.
These are very interesting. Now, a difference between RCTs and this is that RCTs, with all the problems you mentioned, they have at least a lot of requirements, methodological requirements that impose discipline. Even then you said, well, 90% is run by industry, and therefore, you know, they kind of play around with it. Now, here, who will use this, and to what extent can you avoid these incentive problems, which could become, of course, potentially much bigger, given that there are so many methodological choices to make.
So your question is who will generate the real world data, and who will...
That's right, and how will you, because I guess the end is still use all that for drug approval, I guess. Huh?
Yeah, well.
And so who will come, is everybody allowed to come with evidence? Or, so I don't know.
Yeah, I think at the moment, who is investing a lot in real world data is also industry again, because of course, it's an important source of data. How do we, again, avoid, let's say, the same problems as we do with randomized controlled trials? It's difficult. I think the non-commercial sector has an important role to play as well in real world data research, but at the moment, I think they're a bit more hesitant to get involved in that. They're more, let's say, working on typical, the traditional randomized controlled trial, for example. So it's a difficult question to address, I think, right now. I'm happy to discuss it more during the break if you want, but I think it will...
No, but just, you know, at the end of the day, you mentioned this very well in your first part of your talk, payers, health technology assessment bodies have difficult decision to taking into consideration not only the efficacy, but the cost effectiveness. And is it right that to assess this aspect, real world data can be extremely useful, and that HTA and payers, we are very close to Angor Geitler, probably you know him.
Yes.
He was at EMA, he's now a payer in Austria. It would be interesting to discuss this question with him, but my understanding is that payers pay a lot of attention to those real world data and evidence. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, indeed. It's not that these like payers and regulators also nowadays, they are also paying more attention, let's say, to real world data and real world evidence to support their decision making. But often the source, or let's say the stakeholders that deliver that data to them is still the commercial sector at the moment. I think we're evolving towards, let's say, more public use of real world data as well. But yeah, at the moment, it's still very niche. Yeah.
Again, it's a debate, but I don't want to give to our attendees the impression, which is not true, that industry is really controlling
No,
everything.
not.
Obviously, they have enhanced a number of data, but especially when collecting real world data, there are other stakeholders which are at play, including, and their role is, more and more important, patient organizations, because we should not forget that at the end of the day, the patients are waiting for this new treatment, so they are following this very closely, and they've clearly a growing influence.
Yeah, no, thank you for that addition. It's very relevant, I think. Moving on then. So in oncology specifically, real world data and real world evidence
There is
are.
an additional.
Sorry, yeah.
You're speaking about data. When I hear data, I hear AI.
Yeah.
And I would like to know, so with just the slide before, with those barriers, is AI, or which direction are we taking to solve those barriers? And is AI taken into account in this direction?
Yes, I do believe AI is indeed being used also to address some of these barriers. Especially now the methodological barriers are, I mean, they're kind of to some extent inherent to these kind of data. But at the same time, when you have large data sets, you can kind of come up with a model that can analyze these data, taking into account, for example, all these confounding factors, which at the moment, I mean, for human analysts is very difficult. But if you have, let's say, the data sets available, then the machine learning models could indeed generate some kind of insights based purely on analyzing those data sets. So I think artificial intelligence is helping in that sense, especially for the methodological barriers. Also, of course, I mean, to some extent, the technical hurdles. So yeah, it's definitely, I mean, these two go hand in hand, real world data, artificial intelligence, machine learning. All of these topics are very much closely related hot topics, let's say, in medicine. Okay, so in oncology, we see, of course, the rise of the precision medicine model, which aims to provide the right patients with the right drug at the right time. And this precision medicine model has also, let's say, made it more complicated to run large-scale randomized controlled trials. Why? Because simply your target population is becoming more narrow, more defined by specific genetic mutations. And in that sense, it might be difficult to get a sample of participants and randomize them into two groups, for example, because you simply don't have a lot of let's say, patients that have that specific genetic mutation. So that is an important contributing factor to the popularity also of real-world data and real-world evidence in oncology. We also see, and this is also what Professor de Watripon has commented on, an increasing use of expedited approval pathways. So drugs are being approved faster, are reaching the market faster, which is of course good. It leads to faster access of patients to innovation, but at the same time, it often leads to data drugs being approved based on, let's say, less mature data. And in that sense, what regulators often ask is to collect additional data in the post-approval environment to see how these data mature over time, for example. So this is, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to make a comment with respect to that. Indeed, the conditional agreements that extra data would be given. We know from Cartier, who did that study, that this additional data didn't really suffice what we needed to have to keep on reimbursing those drugs. But also, and I would like to hear your comments on that. And we have a comment online from Sana, who's also working actually on this fast track approval. And I would like to give her as well some time to make her comment.
Yeah. So should I answer your question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, indeed. Indeed, what we see is that those data that are collected in the post-approval environment don't always, let's say, address the uncertainties that are being raised, especially by HTA bodies, by payers. How can we solve this? It's a very difficult issue, I think. Here again, I think communication between HTA bodies and regulators is essential because they need to set let's say, standard criteria for what kind of data are being collected, what type of studies should be performed, and also, impose some kind of, let's say, obligations on what type of data are being collected in the post-approval environment as well.
I can make a comment and give an example, because the other limitation of this expedited approval pathway is, question of communication to patients, because clearly with this type of pathway, you may miss rare, sometimes severe side events. Obviously, in cancer, especially in difficult cancer, you might say, okay, that's the price to pay because those events are rare. Just one example, CAR T cells, I think you mentioned there, CAR T cells, extremely popular. As you know, FDA just produced a warning explaining that CAR T cells can cause secondary cancers. And obviously, these only appear after those treatments are used in large number of patients. Those are rare complications. But when you are the patient suffering from it, you say, what's this that the FDA approved and they didn't mention?
Yeah.
So I think that's very important to consider not only the HTA perspective, but also the patient perspective. Actually, the FDA on this did very well because they now produce and companies are obliged to put this in the warning notes.
Yeah.
Okay, we let you continue.
Maybe first,
I can quickly ask my question, please. So we mentioned the importance of patient advocacy, and I think you are well aware of the PROMs, so patient-reported outcomes measures. And I'd like to know if in the field of oncology, if we are already incorporating those PROMs into RCT's efforts.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. It's something that's coming up more recently, indeed, and I don't think we're seeing it as much as we would like in RCTs in oncology. But I think we can consider, for example, PROMs also a type of real-world evidence or real-world data, because it's data that you collect directly from patients, data that is very important because it really shows what patients care about and how patients experience certain outcomes. Those types of data should play an essential role as well. But I think at the moment, not seeing it as much as we would like, but we're moving in the direction of increase of those kinds of endpoints.
And I think what's very interesting with those PROMs, it's that it's happening without any interpretation by healthcare professionals or anyone else. So indeed, it can be very valuable. Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I also have some graphs to show you indeed that there's an increasing use of, for example, the conditional approval pathway within EMA. And that actually the majority of conditional approvals are granted to oncology drugs. So it's really an important topic within oncology. We also see that decision makers, and that's what we also already discussed, are kind of accepting real-world evidence more and more. We see that on the part of regulators, but also payers and HTA bodies. So really, we see an increasing embrace of this type of evidence as it also matures and as best practices are being developed. But one of the less known, or what is less known, let's say, is what, let's say, downstream decision makers like clinicians, but also patients, think about this type of evidence and this type of data. So this is actually something that I addressed within my PhD research. I think in the interest of time, I will not go over this in a lot of detail, but the gist of it is that we did kind of like a questionnaire targeting specifically cancer clinicians in Europe. So we surveyed the ERTC network to get kind of their opinions about what real-world data and real-world evidence can do and how valuable these are. And in total, we reached about 30 different countries with this survey. And maybe it's a bit difficult to see, the colors are a bit strange in the projection, but what we saw is that about 75% of the clinicians we surveyed had positive opinions about real-world evidence, and about like a plurality, almost a majority of them also at the same time thought that real-world evidence cannot fully address all the evidence gaps that are currently available. So they do also acknowledge the, let's say, the limitations of real-world evidence. And we also confronted them with exactly those challenges that I already discussed with you. And here it was perceived clearly that the methodological challenges are the most difficult to overcome challenges associated with real-world data and real-world evidence. And when we look at what their experience with this type of studies, with real-world data studies was, actually we saw that 2/3 of the participants had experience being involved in real-world data studies, and that the majority of those who hadn't yet participated in this kind of studies felt that they were interested in participating in such studies in the future. So it clearly shows that there's a lot of interest also on the part of clinicians. And actually, we also did a similar survey for patients, but the data of that is being analyzed right now. So that's something to look forward to in the future. So yeah, the main conclusions from this study, so knowing that cancer clinicians are either experienced in real data studies or interested in getting involved in them, have positive opinions about real evidence, but at the same time are kind of unconvinced about the ability of such evidence to fill all the evidence gaps with which they are currently faced. And they believe methodological barriers are, let's say, the most significant challenges associated with real data research. Okay, so let's move on then to the second topic, which is the interventional approaches. And then I come really to the core of my presentation, namely the pragmatic trials. So pragmatic trials, actually, they're sometimes also referred to as interventional real-world data studies. So in essence, you can also consider pragmatic trials a type of real-world data study, but not observational in setup. And the two most important characteristics of pragmatic trials are that they try to emulate real-world practice, try to mimic what is going on in real-world practice, and that they generate results that ideally should be generalizable to the entire patient population. I think those are the two core characteristics of pragmatic trials. But also, before I can go into more detail on what pragmatic trials are, I should also explain what they are not. And what they are not is explanatory. So explanatory trials are kind of the opposite of pragmatic trials, sort of the antonym of pragmatic trials. So if we look at what an explanatory trial is, it's basically, I don't know if you've ever worked in a lab, but if you have, you know that in a lab, sometimes we do experiments in a bell jar, which means like under a glass, let's say, setup where we control the environment in which the experiment takes place. So we control the temperature, we control the pressure, we control the environment. So instead of it being exposed to air, it can be exposed to nitrogen gas, for example. Well, I compare it always to that. An explanatory trial is like doing a trial under a bell jar. You control the environment in which the trial takes place. So you set, let's say, all these criteria. And what an explanatory trial is designed to address is the question, can the treatment work if it is applied under ideal circumstances? So under this bell jar, let's say. As such, an explanatory trial is designed to measure treatment efficacy, which is actually a measure of how well something works under ideal circumstances. Now, of course, the question then is, what exactly are these ideal circumstances in a clinical trial environment? Well, it's all about ensuring a controlled environment. And how do you do that? For example, by rolling your trial out only in university hospitals, which are, hospitals where the most experienced investigators work, where they have access to the most advanced equipment, for example. So that's an important factor. It is also, you can also ensure a controlled environment by recruiting a homogeneous sample of participants. So participants that satisfy a long list of inclusion and exclusion criteria. And in that sense are quite homogeneous. Not so different from one another, let's say. It's sometimes also referred to as, let's say, the Olympic athlete of patients. You allow only those kinds of patients to participate that are already doing better than their off-trial peers, let's say. Then it also involves giving extensive training to investigators and study nurses. So to ensure that they basically what they do is uniform and it complies with the trial protocol. It also involves monitoring participants according to a fixed schedule. So they have to come back to the hospital every month, for example, specifically to do specific tests. All of that is tightly defined. It's also done by keeping track of participants' compliance with treatment. So ensuring that essentially they don't miss a specific dose of a drug, for example. And if they do, they might even be excluded from the analysis. So all of this is done to ensure that you get a clean and nice signal and basically a high signal to noise ratio. You kind of reduce the noise and you get a nice signal. And that's what an explanatory trial is designed to do. And I think that's relevant. In some cases, it makes sense to do that, especially with new types of drugs. You need to first understand, can this drug work before you can investigate, will it actually work in real world circumstances? But pragmatic trials are different. So it's basically like doing this trial outside of the bell jar. And pragmatic trials address a different question. They address the question, will the treatment work if it is applied in real world clinical practice? As such, they measure also a different thing. They measure effectiveness rather than efficacy. Effectiveness is a measure of how well something works in real world clinical practice. So again, what then does real world clinical practice look like? Well, it's all about mimicking real life conditions. And how do you do that? By rolling your trial out, for example, in multiple different types of hospitals, not only university hospitals, but also community hospitals. By recruiting a heterogeneous sample of participants, so being, let's say, less strict with your inclusion and exclusion criteria. By giving little to no training to investigators and study nurses. So there might be variety in how they apply the specific treatment. By monitoring participants according to a flexible schedule rather than a fixed schedule. So you monitor them, for example, when they are supposed to come back for a routine visit rather than asking them to come back specifically to do follow-up tests that wouldn't happen in clinical practice. And by tolerating also participants' lack of compliance with treatment, because in the real world, patients might also sometimes forget to take a specific dose of their drug, for example. So all of that, of course, results in more noise. You'll get more noise, which means that it's more difficult to find the signal. As you can see here, it's difficult to discern the signal, but it's important because this is how it also happens in the real world. You have many of these interfering things that come into play, and that can have an impact on the effectiveness of your treatment. And just to illustrate, because I've often given the same presentation to patients as well, and try to explain to them what this concept is of pragmatic trials, and I always use this analogy. Imagine if you have a recipe that you want to test, you want to know whether this recipe works and whether it can, for example, result in a nice cake, a delicious cake. So there are two ways to test that. You can either do it according to the explanatory approach, where you ask the question, can this recipe work if a professional chef would try the recipe? So, imagine if you give it to a professional chef has, all the best ingredients at their disposal, maybe a team of sous chefs, all the best equipment. So if they try that recipe, it might result in like something nice like this, right? A very nice, tasty cake that I would definitely like to try. But there's also a different approach, the pragmatic approach, which is then asking a very different question. Will this recipe work if an average person tries it? And I consider myself to be a very average person, probably also with below average cooking skills. So if I would try this recipe, it would maybe look a bit more like this, right? So this is probably a more realistic picture of what happens for the average person trying the recipe. So two different types of questions to explore whether or not this recipe works. The two questions are equally valid, I think, but they just address different. They have a different focus essentially. And as I said, like the average person will probably have an experience that is closer, maybe not as bad as the one in the picture, but closer to the picture on the right than the picture on the left, right? Okay,
If I may challenge you a little bit.
Yeah.
Of course, when you try something new, there will typically be, whether you're a top chef or not, there will be some learning, and which will improve things. How you treated COVID patient. There was some simple thing after a couple of weeks that increased survival rate, everything else equal. So here, by the pragmatic approach, you're maybe making it quite tough on this new drug by saying, okay, so how would you take into account the fact that people will improve over time?
Well, I would say that pragmatic trial approach is not necessarily geared towards new drugs, because if a drug is new, indeed, you want to do it exactly like this explanatory approach. You want to test first, can this drug work before it actually will work in real world practice, right? It's like an experiment in a lab. You want to first see if it can work in this condition, very artificial, but if it works, then you can maybe, let's say, scale it up to real world environment. So I think it's a different setting. I think the two are, as I said, equally valid. It's just that they are applied under different circumstances. I will come back to that also later then. So an important observation here is that there is an important gap between efficacy and effectiveness. So as you move from a clinical trial scenario, like you see on the left of this graph, and you move towards, let's say, a real world scenario, towards like the outside label scenario, you typically see, of course, that the variability increases, right? You get more factors that come into play. It's like a less constrained environment. So the variability increases. And as that happens, at the same time, what you see is that the benefit-risk ratio, which is exactly what regulators look at, it's taking into account also, it's measuring the benefits of the drug, taking into account also the side effects. You see that benefit-risk ratio often decreases as you move into a real-world scenario. And that's exactly the efficacy-effectiveness gap, like the gap between efficacy, which is more in a clinical trial scenario, very constrained, and effectiveness, which is in a real-world scenario. So generally, again, it's a general statement, treatment efficacy will nearly always be larger than effectiveness, right? The effect you observe in ideal circumstances will probably be the best possible effect you can achieve. And once you get into the real world, that effect kind of diminishes a bit. And that in and of itself is not a problem, I think, as long as we know that. But what is a problem, I think, is that nowadays, most clinical trials, and I'm talking here about 99% or more of clinical trials, are geared towards measuring treatment efficacy. And only less than 1% of trials focus on treatment effectiveness. So if you only look at what the data that are coming from clinical trials, you might get like a bit of a, let's say, a wrong image of what this drug will actually achieve once you give it to a real-world patient population.
Just to be clear, when you mention trials, you are talking about RCT trials.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, yeah, very, very true. So indeed, that's not the clinical trial scenario. Here is like a typical explanatory trial, not so much a pragmatic trial, which is a different type of trial, of course.
Would you say that pragmatic trials would indeed assess effectiveness while RCT are assessing efficacy?
Yeah, so, well, just to be clear, a pragmatic trial can also be an RCT. The difference is that an explanatory RCT, so you have the explanatory trials and the pragmatic trials. Explanatory trials are measuring under ideal circumstances and are typically the type of trials that we do, to approve a drug, for example. So the trials that are done during phase 3 of clinical development. Whereas pragmatic trials focus on effectiveness and under real-world circumstances. So typically those kinds of trials, if they are conducted in a post-approval setting with drugs that are already on the market. Okay, so it's a different question. So there are different types of pragmatic trials. So it's also kind of an umbrella term. For example, you have large, simple trials. I mean, what like the name says, it's these kind of trials are very large trials, but also very simple in their setup. I think during the COVID pandemic, we had, for example, the recovery trial or the solidarity trial. Those are typically large, simple trials designed to recruit a large number of patients and be simple in their setup so that many centers can participate very easily in this kind of trials. We also have registry-based trials, so trials that take place within a registry, that are nested within a registry, so that use patients that are being followed as part of a registry and randomly allocate those patients to a treatment or to a comparison. And then a very specific type of pragmatic trial is a cohort, multiple randomized control trial, or also called a trial within a cohort. These are trials very specific. It's basically a subtype of registry-based trial where actually you give a select group of patients within the trial the choice. So you randomly select these patients and you give them the choice to undergo the investigational treatment, whereas the patients in the comparator group are not even aware that a trial is taking place. So that's a very specific type of trial. An example of such a trial is the rectal boost trial, which is a trial going on or has already ended at this point, but a trial taking place in the Netherlands where they are looking at individuals with rectal cancer patients and specifically individuals that are being followed as part of a large cohort of rectal cancer patients. So they are followed from the moment of their diagnosis to the moment of their death, typically. And within that cohort, you randomly select some patients and you give them the choice to undergo some kind of investigational treatment. In this case, it's an extra dose of radiotherapy after the standard chemoradiation. Whereas the other patients, you don't approach them at all and you just follow them as part of the cohort and they form the control group of your trial. So this is a very specific type of trial. It's actually also an example of a registry-based trial. But just to give you an indication that there are different types of pragmatic trials, can be very complicated in their setup in and of itself. But yeah, they are geared towards having following patients up in a real-world scenario, let's say. Now, what is the value of pragmatic trials? Why are pragmatic trials so valuable to conduct? Well, pragmatic trials, I think, are especially valuable to patients. Why? Because they paint a more realistic picture of a treatment's benefits and harms for the average patient, rather than for this Olympic athlete that sometimes participates in the clinical trials. Also for clinicians, because they guide clinical decision making. I mean, for clinicians, the patients they see in their practice are more like the pragmatic trial participant than the participant in, of course, the explanatory trials. And also to payers, because they also directly inform reimbursement-related decision-making in many cases. Effectiveness is, of course, relevant to payers because they are the ones making decisions on real-world scenarios, let's say. Pragmatic trials combine the methodological strengths of RCTs, randomization, with the inclusiveness of studies that analyze real data. So it's a bit the best of both worlds in a way. So as such, you can also consider them to be sources of robust and actionable real-world evidence. So just to challenge also the bit, because sometimes there's a dichotomy made between real-world data and randomized controlled trials, but in reality, there is no dichotomy. They can be combined. You know, you can have a randomized controlled trial that produces real-world evidence. So it's not that it's like, yeah, a dichotomy. It's really, they complement each other, I would say. So here also we see that pragmatic trials nowadays are gaining more and more attention. For example, last year, the European Commission launched a call for pragmatic trials under the Horizon Europe funding program. So a call to optimize treatments for patients with refractory cancers using pragmatic clinical trials. And as part of this call, right now, there are actually 12 trials ongoing that have been funded using public funding and that are all pragmatic trials. Some of them are just for disclosure, some of them are being conducted by the ERTC. But I think it's important because it illustrates, yeah, really that there's an increasing interest in these types of trials. We also see in the US, if we look a bit across the ocean, the FDA is doing a lot surrounding this as well. So they have launched a project called Project Pragmatica, which aims to ensure the conduct of simple clinical trials in oncology. So essentially focusing only on the most essential. So having one primary endpoint that's overall survival, for example, and limiting all kinds of other data collection to a minimum. So for example, data related to safety and toxicity, those are kept to a minimum. And this kind of project, of course, focuses mostly on drugs that are already available on the market and that have been studied already for a long time. So we know their safety profile. So for the FDA in those circumstances, it doesn't really make sense to collect a lot of additional data that we already have access to. So that's a bit the philosophy behind the project Pragmatica. And as part of this project, actually, a trial is currently ongoing, which is called the Pragmatica Lung trial in the US. So this trial is actually being conducted by a cooperative group, so within the context of the National Cancer Institute, and is being supported by FDA, but also by industry. So it's really a nice collaboration between different stakeholders. And what this trial is looking at is actually a combination of two existing drugs, using that in the treatment of non-small cell lung cancer. And so this trial is a very pragmatic trial. I will not go into the details right now, but you can look it up. It's really a trial that was designed to be as pragmatic as possible. And the FDA has committed to using the results from this trial to also review this combination of drugs. So if the results are positive, it will lead to the uptake of this, or the regulatory approval of this combination of drugs, which is quite interesting because normally the types of trials that support the approval of a drug are really explanatory and not pragmatic at all. So really we see the FDA is doing a lot surrounding pragmatic trials at the moment. Here in Europe, it's a bit less busy at the moment, I think. EMA has been a lot less active in this sense. What we do see now is that pragmatic trials are being, addressed to some extent within the context of the ACT-EU initiative, the Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU initiative. For example, by facilitating the conduct of decentralized trials. where patients are being followed as much as possible from their home environment rather than having to go to a specific hospital for follow-up tests. So it is to some extent being addressed within the context of that, but it's not the main focus of the project. At the same time, the EMA has also set up the Cancer Medicines Forum, which is also a collaboration with EORTC, and there also pragmatic trials are being put on the agenda, let's say. So there we see that pragmatic trials play an important role during the discussions of the Cancer Medicines Forum. We see that industry is doing some things around pragmatic trials. So they are also, for example, here a guidance paper, kind of thinking about the role of pragmatic trials and under what circumstances they can also conduct pragmatic clinical trials. So I think that's also a very positive development. And on a national level, we see that there are some funding programs that support the conduct of pragmatic trials. For example, in Belgium, we have the KCE Trials program, which is actually specifically designed to support the conduct of pragmatic clinical trials. And there are similar programs in other countries like the UK, like the Netherlands. So we see there's quite a lot ongoing. Now, of course, pragmatic trials have a number of important challenges as well. For example, the analysis of these trials can be complex. Like I said, you have a lot of noise. It might be difficult to find the signal amid all this noise. The funding, there's not always funding available for this kind of trials, mostly because, I mean, again, their topic might not be necessarily of commercial interest. So it's difficult to, let's say, get the investment into this kind of trial. So industry is not necessarily always interested in funding this type of trial. And so we're kind of relying on public resources for this kind of thing. And now, of course, there's very limited amount of public resources. There's a lack of regulatory guidance surrounding the conduct of these trials. So EMA has not really produced like a paper on pragmatic trials saying this is how you should conduct a pragmatic trial. So there's not much guidance there available. There's a lack of a specific legal framework. So at the moment, all clinical trials have to abide by, let's say, the same legal framework, which is very much geared towards explanatory trials. For example, to some extent, it obligates the collection of safety data, which in a pragmatic trial might not always be relevant to collect on such a large scale. There's a lack of experience of investigators with this kind of trial, so they might be unfamiliar with pragmatic trials, unwilling to participate, especially if they know also that they can participate in an explanatory trial that will be published in the Lancet Oncology, the New England Journal of Medicine. That will, of course, very strongly advance their own careers as well. So, I mean, there's a bit of a competing interest there as well. There's also competition with explanatory trials for patient recruitment. Of course, there's only a limited number of patients available. So how do we ensure that we can recruit enough patients for these trials? And to some extent, there's also some ethical concerns. For example, what I showed you, this trials within cohorts, the fact that essentially you don't inform the patients in the control group that a trial is going on, that is very much something that ethically can be quite dubious, because your patients are participating in a trial without actually knowing that they're part of a trial. So that's ethically speaking quite challenging as well. Now you might be wondering, okay, but how do I then recognize a pragmatic trial? And unfortunately, that question is not so simple. So I think it's important to note that trials exist generally on a spectrum, ranging from more explanatory to more pragmatic. So for example, you can have a trial that is not open to elderly patients, so that has a very specific age cutoff, and that is being conducted in one specific single center. Of course, based on just that information, you will probably think that this trial is quite explanatory, so you would put it, let's say, more on the left side of the spectrum. Then you can have a trial which is open to elderly patients, but still conducted in a single center. This kind of trial would be, again, based solely on this information, more pragmatic. And then you have a trial C, for example, which can be open to elderly patients, but also taking place in multiple centers. So that trial would be even more pragmatic. So you would rank it more to the right. So just to illustrate that it's really a spectrum. It's not like a black and white difference of this is a pragmatic trial and this is an explanatory trial. There is, it's important to note that that it's a spectrum. Okay, so
we have 20 minutes left online, and I'm sure there will be many questions.
Yes,
so perhaps you can try But
Yeah.
obviously he was interrupted very often, so we apologize for that. But I think it's important that we keep some time.
Yeah,
for
of course.
open
Yeah, I will
discussion.
try to summarize very quickly. So I think just important to note, labels can be deceiving, so don't be deceived by the label pragmatic trial. It's not because it's labeled as a pragmatic trial that it's actually a pragmatic trial. And there's a tool available that allows you to evaluate how pragmatic a trial is, which is the PRECIS-2 tool. And this tool evaluates the trial design based on 9 distinct domains. So I will not go through all of them in the interest of time, but basically you have to evaluate the trial across all these 9 domains to be able to tell how pragmatic it is. And you can also visually display that using what is known as a PRECIS-2 wheel. So it's basically like a radar chart where you can display the different scores for the different domains. And then you can, for example, get a result like this, where you look at the area of the figure and you can tell how pragmatic it is, because the larger the figure is, the more pragmatic, and the smaller it is, the more explanatory. Looking specifically at pragmatic trials in oncology. So I did a study during my PhD to look at pragmatic trials in oncology. So I did well, the objectives of the study were to identify pragmatic labeled trials of anti-tumor treatments and to assess the level of pragmatism using this tool that I just presented. And the method, so we did like a systematic literature review, and we did subsequently an analysis, a PRECIS-2 analysis using this tool. So I will go through this quickly. So in total, we identified 42 of these pragmatic labeled trials in the literature, specifically in oncology. And what we saw is that if we classify them based on their decade of initiation of the trial, we see that there's an increasing number of trials being conducted, an increasing number of pragmatic trials over time, or at least pragmatic labeled trials, and that most of these are still focusing on pharmacological treatments, but also quite a significant portion on radiotherapeutic and other treatment options. And I think the most important observations here for this study was that the sample that we investigated actually showed a very strong lack of pragmatic characteristics. So, for example, they were non-randomized or single-arm trials. Many of them were placebo-controlled. Many of them used surrogate outcomes as primary endpoints. Many of them took place in a single center or even in a single country. And to some extent, there were also some trials that were sponsored by industry, which again, in and of itself, doesn't mean that it can be pragmatic, but it's important to note, as well. And if we look at the results of our PRECIS-2 analysis, we found that the median trial had a PRECIS-2 total score of 3.13. And if just for your information, the PRECIS-2 scale goes from 1 to 5. So from 1 being very explanatory to 5 being very pragmatic. So really the median trial had only a score of 3, which is kind of in the middle of the scale. So really not more pragmatic than explanatory, despite the fact that these trials were labeled as pragmatic. Some domains were also more pragmatic than others. Here you can see the PRECIS-2 wheel for the median trial, where you can clearly see that some domains are more pragmatic than others, are more further away from the center of the circle. And what we also saw is that there was often missing information, that it was impossible to fully grade the trial because we just lacked the information. It was not reported. And here, just an example of a very good pragmatic trial. Again, I will not go in detail on this, but it's a RADCOMP trial, which actually compares proton therapy and photon therapy, and is a very pragmatic trial that we identified in our analysis with a PRECIS-2 score of 4.22. At the same time, there were also some very bad pragmatic trials, let's say, or trials that were labeled as pragmatic, but in reality were very explanatory. So some sins to avoid, I think, is to not interpret pragmatism as a multifaceted concept. So it's really a multifaceted concept. You need to look at all these 9 domains of the PRECIS-2 tool, not providing justification for the use of this label, and also just not linking your setup to your objective. You want to have a setup that matches with your objective, what you want to achieve in your trial. So sometimes it's not relevant to do a pragmatic trial. So yeah, again, the main conclusions from this study is that the use of this label is increasing, that trials that are labeled as pragmatic are not very pragmatic in practice, that the pragmatic trial concept is not very well understood by trialists working in the field of oncology, and that there is a need for truly pragmatic cancer trials. So based on that, I also formulated some recommendations for boosting the number of truly pragmatic trials. I think there are 2 elements to it, 2 strategies. On the one hand, it's holding investigators and sponsors of pragmatic labeled trials accountable. for the studies that they perform. So scientific journals have a role to play there by, for example, imposing the publication of PRECY2 scores alongside the trial publication, by increasing also scrutiny from editors and reviewers. If you have a paper where a pragmatic trial is being described, is this actually a pragmatic trial? This is something that reviewers and editors should be asking. Also, decision makers, so regulators can play a role here on a national level, an international level. Also, of course, HTA bodies and payers, they can also have a role here in terms of making sure that trials that are labeled as pragmatic are actually pragmatic in practice as well. And then also ethics committees have a role to play because also they review the trial protocol, and they can also have a voice here in terms of making sure that indeed your trial actually does what it says it does, right? So, and a second element of the recommendations is to create, let's say, a clinical research environment that is also conducive to the conduct of truly pragmatic trials. This means maybe loosening regulatory obligations imposed on sponsors of pragmatic trials. So considering explanatory trials and pragmatic trials separately within the legal framework. For example, this is already to some extent being done within the EU clinical trials regulation. There's a concept of the low intervention trials, which actually is very much geared towards, I think, pragmatic trials. So we'll have to see how that is being implemented in practice. I think pragmatic trials ideally should also be financed using public resources, considering the questions that they ask are of public health value, and the data that they produce are also of public value. And especially also knowing that many of these trials will generate savings in the long run. So the money that you invest into them will also, in the long run, lead to money being saved. And you could think about setting up a type of revolving fund where the savings could then be reinvested into more pragmatic trials. So to have a revolving fund. This is also, I mean, to some extent already being done. As I said, like in Europe, KC trials, those are using public resources to fund pragmatic trials. And then, of course, pragmatic trials should also be able to influence decision-making to some extent. So here the example of Pragmatic Along, where the FDA is actively involved and indeed committing to using the data from that trial to review the application, for example, of this combination of drugs. And lastly, I think it's also important to establish an international research network that is capable of conducting pragmatic trials in a cross-border fashion. It makes sense to run these trials on an international level, I think. Here, for example, we could follow the example of Darwin EU, which is doing that with observational data, but you could think about setting up a similar structure with interventional type data, which is focused on conducting clinical trials. So I think the key learnings from my presentation, to sum up, I think observational approaches alone, I think, are unlikely to fill the cancer clinical research gap completely. They are very relevant, they are needed, but they will not fill the gap, at least at the moment, completely, due to the inherent methodological shortcomings of such analyses. To close the gap, I think truly pragmatic trials, RCTs, are needed and should be integrated into this paradigm for developing treatments. I think at the moment, pragmatic labeled cancer trials are no more pragmatic than they are explanatory, so that's definitely a problem. So I think in that sense, investigators and sponsors of pragmatic trials should be held accountable for the studies that they perform, and clinical research frameworks need to become more conducive to the conduct of pragmatic trials. So in my opinion, I think pragmatic trials are the missing link between clinical development and clinical practice. So yeah, that's hopefully they can really fill this gap, this cancer clinical research gap that I already addressed in my presentation. So thank you very much. Happy to take your question.
We have two questions online. First one is from Roxana Albu. You can ask your question.
Thank you, Robbe, for a very nice presentation. I just want to ask, how do you think European health data space in the current form, it's still in discussion, and it's probably will be voted as it is by the end of the parliamentary election period. How do you think it will impact the pragmatic trials and the way they will be conducted in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Roxana. I think the European health data space has an important role to play, because if we look at how data in a pragmatic trial are collected, I think we can collect these data also, or we can rely on standard collection of data, on real data.
PC connected.
Okay. So I think a pragmatic trial can rely on real data sources to collect data on participants of such trials. So instead of collecting that data specifically within the context of the trial, you can think about accessing registries, you can think about accessing electronic health records, and just taking the data from those sources. So in that sense, I think the European health data space will be a huge boost to the conduct of pragmatic trials, also to the conduct of real-world data studies in general, of course. So yeah, I think, again, here also, it's a nice example of how real-world data and pragmatic trials, randomized controlled trials, can be complementary, can complement each other. Yeah, because if you think about it, you want to, in a pragmatic trial, you want to follow up what happens in real-world clinical practice. So if you rely on data that are already being collected about real-world clinical practice, then it makes sense to use that data for your trial as well. So I think, yeah, in summary, it's going to be a huge boost to the conduct of pragmatic trials as well. Yeah.
And we have a question from Sanai.
Yeah, so me again. Yeah, so I'd like to know, considering the disparities in clinical trials numbers between the US and Europe mainly, for the US attractivity being high, can we assume that access to pragmatic trials is seemingly uneven across those regions? And additionally, with you mentioned the EMA's initiatives to enhance the number of pragmatic trials. Is it possible to believe that we can get a unique European expertise and approach in pragmatic trials, given Europe's more stringent, efficient, high-quality clinical trial environment, which actually paradoxically might sometimes diminish its attractiveness for hosting a large number of clinical trials?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. I think at the moment, yes, the US is, a more attractive environment to conduct trials. And if we look at what the FDA is doing with Project Pragmatic, I think this will also be the case for pragmatic trials. If it indeed is going to be scaled up on a general level, and the FDA supports those kind of trials, then I think we will see that indeed there will also be more pragmatic trials being conducted in the United States. I think for now, pragmatic trials in Europe are being, we have some funding programs, like I mentioned, like KCE trials, like in the Netherlands, you have some programs as well. In the UK, you have the HTA program. Of course, those kind of programs are set up because we need those kind of data to support the reimbursement decision. So in that sense, in Europe, you have let's say a demand for, more demand, let's say, for pragmatic trials at the moment. But yeah, we have to create this environment that is conducive to pragmatic trials, and that means, I think, stepping a bit away from this tendency maybe to regulate it and to let's say just impose the conduct of those types of trials on industry, because that's also not going to be, that shouldn't be the intention, I think. So in summary, yes, I think the clinical research environment in the US will be, at least if the FDA continues its current initiatives, will be very conducive to the conduct of pragmatic trials. But at the moment, we see in Europe plays an important role as well, because we have these funding programs within the context of reimbursement decisions, for example. Sorry, I completely forgot your second question. Can you maybe repeat?
It was just about, the fact that Europe is well known for its savoir-faire that can sometimes diminish the attractiveness from the industry to host clinical trials. So I thought it can be linked to pragmatic trials, the fact that it's, maybe you can.
No, indeed, it shouldn't be the intention to say, okay, industry should do these pragmatic trials. I think that's the simple solution that will not work in the long term, because it will just indeed increase the burden on them, and it will force them to invest more. And indeed, then you have competition with the other countries like the US. Of course, that makes sense. So I think that's what I also mentioned. I think it makes sense to invest public resources into the conduct of pragmatic trials, because they actually look at public health value questions. So in that sense, I don't think that's a solution. We need to be mindful of not just saying, impose it on industry. I don't think that will work. So indeed, we need to create this environment, and for that, I think we need to have increased public funding in practice.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Robbe, you show a slide with the increasing number of pragmatic trials in Europe or EMA supported. Do you have a similar slide from the US or from FDA to compare the number of trials and the number of patients enrolled in pragmatically?
So that figure that I showed was from my literature review. So it's not that it shows that there's an increasing number of pragmatic trials. It shows that there's an increasing number of pragmatic labeled trials.
Okay.
So, and as I showed in this analysis, just because a trial is labeled pragmatic doesn't mean it is pragmatic in practice. So I think what that figure shows is that there's an increasing interest in these types of trials. Whether it means that there are more pragmatic trials being conducted, that I think doesn't necessarily follow from that. But the literature review was not just done for Europe, so it also includes trials from the US. Okay. So it's kind of on a, I would say, a global perspective.
Okay. No, I have a more fundamental question.
Yes.
You mentioned precision medicine as the way forward in oncology. As you know, there is a recent Nature paper showing that efficient trials should actually combine different types of cancer. I don't know if you saw that. And actually, with the precision medicine concept, actually, each cancer will become a rare disease, right?
Right.
And if you think about rare disease, how can you organize this collection of real-world data and all these things? So don't you think that, in a way, the current strategy in terms of developing more tailored targeted treatments will make those trials much more difficult and will take more time because you need to enroll a sufficient number of patients? What would be your comment?
Yeah, I fully agree that actually the precision medicine model makes it also more difficult, for example, to run pragmatic trials, because these kind of precision medicine trials are highly constrained trials where you have very specific rules of which patient receives which treatment under which circumstances. I don't think it necessarily means that you cannot build certain pragmatic elements into those trials. But again, it's here a question of what is your objective of your trial. If your objective is to get a new drug onto the market, a new precision medicine, it makes complete sense to have a very explanatory trial where you just have a very constrained environment and you look at whether this drug can work. And then you have, for example, these umbrella trials and the basket trials, etc. But once it is on the market, you can think more about, in the long run, when more is known about this drug, the safety profile is well known, then you can think about running a pragmatic trial using, for example, also real data that are being collected. Of course, the scale of this trial may be smaller than you would expect it to be, maybe based on it taking place in a real world environment. But I don't think it necessarily excludes the possibility of doing a pragmatic trial in the long run. But I agree with you in the sense of you cannot always do a pragmatic trial. Like, it doesn't make sense to do that in many circumstances. It's just you have to apply this concept in the right circumstances. And that is usually more in the long run in the post-approval environment.
Maybe a last question before we will close that too. You showed that indeed there's an increasing amount of publications on pragmatic trials, but you also mentioned that we need skilled people, not only PIs, but also the ethical review board, the editors, the reviewers. What would you recommend? Where does this training will come from really making the difference between pragmatic and then the explanatory trials? Where would you include this in the continuous education of PIs and reviewers and editors and ethical review boards?
That's
experts?
A good question. I think, I mean, in order to become, for example, an investigator, doctors or oncologists, they need to follow some training, of course, like on good clinical practice. I think it has a role there. I think you could include it to some extent in that training. That's, of course, for the investigators. For the editors and the reviewers, it's a matter of making sure that there's some kind of standard practice available, some document, like you have the consort guidelines or all these kind of guidelines that already exist for RCTs. I think you can create similar guidelines for pragmatic trials in particular. And also, I mean, it also extends to patients. I mean, you also need to educate patients on this topic, and there we can also, I think, devise targeted trainings on this topic and make sure that that patients are also aware of what pragmatic trials are, what the difference is with explanatory trials. Like I've given a similar presentation to patients, and they were, they have no idea of what the difference is between a pragmatic trial and explanatory trial. They have no idea about this. So I think it makes sense to also target them and to make sure that they understand what they are participating in, because oftentimes they have really no idea, which is really that shouldn't be the case. So I think it's really targeting every stakeholder, maybe through targeted trainings, but I think training is important in general.
I'm a bit surprised that you didn't mention contract research organization, CRO, as important players. Would you like to comment on this?
Well, I mean, they have also an important role to play, of course, because they are the ones, I think, doing most of the clinical research or regulating, or like regulating not so much, but like the organization of the clinical research. Or also they have a role to play. I think indeed maybe I should include them also in my list of people to target them. You're right. Yeah.
To continue with what she said on the training that we provide, do you think that language is a baseline that should be trained for everyone? What I mean by this is some diseases or some cancers do not have the same description depending on some doctors. And so do you think that having a universal baseline language to describe some trials would be a solution?
I do think that's really important. I think there needs to be consensus and uniformity on this kind of information. For example, also real world data. I mean, knowing that there's no standard definition for real world data is already strange, because it's a concept that is used so much, and we might be talking about a completely different thing when we're talking about real world data with each other. So in that sense, I think, for example, for real world data, regulators can have a role there and on doing it on an international level, coming to a consensus on what is the definition of real world data. Similar things can happen, I think, about communicating about pragmatic trials, about real world data. What type of information do you provide to patients? All of that can be, to some extent, I think, made more uniform, and I think that will only help the communication for sure.
Maybe a last short comment from Matthias.
Very, very short, thank you. Well, thanks a lot for a very interesting presentation. If I want to summarize, maybe excessively, so pragmatic trials are cheaper and less methodologically demanding than explanatory trial. Let me simplify. And it's a question as an economist of cost-benefit analysis, and you mentioned, for example, the FDA example of trying to combine two existing treatments, and therefore you already knew stuff about this. And then, so does that mean, point number one, that drug repurposing in general is something where you want to do the same things? And second, another thing, and you said, well, in cancer, you do a lot of it. And that reminds me of a paper, another paper by Andrew Lowe and others, about the fact that often we don't take into account enough when we decide what to approve or not. What is the default option? If the default option is very bad, you're dead within 3 weeks, then you can take some risks. If you have a long-run disease which will not going to kill you and so on, then you want to be more conservative. Does that mean that you want to go pragmatic, especially in cases where indeed prospects without that are pretty bad? Of course, you need to inform the patients that this is what they are getting into. But in a sense, I'm trying to look at general guidelines about when you want to do this.
Yeah, I think maybe to come back to what you said in the beginning, I don't think pragmatic trials are necessarily cheaper to conduct. I think that's kind of, sometimes that assumption is made. I don't think it is necessarily the case. I mean, it can be difficult to run these trials, knowing that they are, let's say, less in a less regulated environment. You still need access to these data. I just don't think necessarily that they will be cheaper to conduct. And methodologically speaking, maybe they are a bit less rigorous, you could say, than an explanatory trial. But the point is of a pragmatic trial still to keep the randomization aspect So in that sense, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that is less methodologically rigorous, let's say. So just, I think those are two often misconceptions, I think, about pragmatic trials. So it's good that you bring that up. And about your point of when do you apply this kind of trial, I think indeed for repurposing, it makes a lot of sense because you're looking at drugs that are available on the market, that have a well-known safety profile, and you want to collect additional information on that. Perfect. You can run a pragmatic trial, and that will serve that purpose very well, I think. I think in the other case, like you say, where you want to have more risk, I'm a bit hesitant because there, if you want to take more risk, maybe it makes more sense to do like an explanatory approach even, because you know, if you have a new drug available and you want to give that to a patient, and patient say, yes, I want to take this drug, even if it has a lot of side effects, then yeah, it makes sense maybe to follow that up in terms of an explanatory trial where you also monitor the side effects, you monitor that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's a different context. Pragmatic trials more in a post-approval environment with existing drugs where we already know a lot of information about. If you want to have more risk, new types of innovations, it makes more sense to explore these in an explanatory setup.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you for all those who joined online. In case you would have more questions, don't hesitate to contact us and we will follow up with Robert for sure. Thank you so much, Robert, for your great talk and this.